One household, one pattern of death, one verdict that would outlast the century in which it was delivered. This is the record of a case that reshaped how a nation looked at the ordinary poisons kept in its own kitchens and cupboards. The case of Mary Ann Cotton begins in County Durham in the early 1830s. To understand what happened inside that household, it is necessary first to understand the world that produced it. County Durham in this period was a coalfield economy, and everything about the region's daily rhythm, its housing, its wages, its churches, its burial customs, was organized around the pit. Villages like Low Morsley and Hetton-le-Hole existed because a coal seam ran beneath them, and the men who worked that seam were paid a wage that fluctuated with the market for coal, rose and fell with strikes and slumps, and rarely stretched far beyond subsistence. Terraced cottages, often rented directly from the colliery that employed their tenants, stood in rows along unpaved lanes. Water was fetched from a shared pump. Sanitation was primitive. Disease moved quickly and indiscriminately through such conditions, and gastric illness in particular, vomiting, cramping, wasting, dehydration, was so common among infants and adults alike that it rarely drew comment from anyone outside the family it struck. This was also a mobile society, in its way. Miners moved from pit village to pit village chasing work, and with them moved their households, their debts, and their domestic arrangements, which were frequently reconstituted through second and third marriages after the early death of a spouse, itself an unremarkable event in a population with a life expectancy far shorter than later generations would come to expect. Women in these communities occupied a narrow economic band. Work available to them was largely domestic: dressmaking, nursing the sick, keeping house for widowers, taking in lodgers. Marriage was, for many, not simply a romantic arrangement, but an economic necessity, and remarriage after widowhood was less a scandal than a survival strategy. One further institution shaped daily life in these communities and will recur throughout this account: the burial club, or friendly society. For a small weekly premium, a family could insure against the cost of a funeral, coffin, plot, minister's fee, for any member of the household, including children. In an era when infant and child mortality was tragically routine, these clubs served a genuine social purpose. They also, as this case will demonstrate, created a financial incentive that a small number of people learned to exploit. Who is not established with precision in the surviving parish and family records is the exact circumstance of the child at the center of this case's final chapter, a boy named Charles Edward Cotton, in the years before the household that would prove fatal to him was formed. His early temperament, his relationship with his natural mother before her death, the particulars of his upbringing prior to 1871, these are not documented in any source that has survived to the present day. What is established is a date and a place. Charles Edward Cotton was born in the early 1860s, the son of a colliery worker named Frederick Cotton, and by 1871 he was living in the pit village of West Auckland, County Durham, in a household that had, within a short span of time, come to include a new stepmother. That domestic arrangement, the marriage of the boy's widowed father to a woman who would become his stepmother and who would outlive him by less than 18 months in freedom before facing trial for his death, is the arrangement this account must now describe in detail, because it is the arrangement from which everything that follows proceeds. The woman in question was born Mary Ann Robson on the 31st of October, 1832, in the village of Low Morsley, near Hetton-le-Hole. Her father was a colliery worker, and by several accounts, a man of strict religious conviction, a Wesleyan Methodist who raised his daughter within a tradition that placed heavy emphasis on scripture, discipline, and the moral seriousness of daily conduct. He died in a mining accident when Mary Ann was a young child, a loss that left the family in the precarious economic position common to mining widows of the era. Mary Ann trained, in her teenage years and early adulthood, as a dressmaker, and she also worked at points as a nurse, an occupation that in this period required no formal certification and granted a working knowledge of illness, medicine, and the administration of remedies to the sick, a detail that would prove consequential in the years that followed. By her late teens, Mary Ann had begun the pattern that would define the rest of her adult life: marriage, followed by the deaths, in rapid and repeated succession, of husbands, children, and other dependents who passed through her household. Her first husband, a colliery worker named William Mowbray, whom she married in 1852, fathered a number of children with her over the following years. The majority did not survive infancy or early childhood, a mortality rate that, while tragically elevated even by the standards of the period, did not at the time draw formal suspicion. Mowbray himself died in 1865, his death recorded as the result of an intestinal disorder. Mary Ann collected a payment from a burial club policy taken out on his life. A second marriage followed within a year to a man named George Ward, who died in 1866 after a short illness characterized, according to surviving descriptions, by severe gastric distress. A policy was again in force. A third domestic arrangement, this one with a shipping agent named James Robinson, whom she kept house for and later married, ended not in his death, but in his growing suspicion of her financial conduct. He discovered that she had run up debts in his name and had, by some accounts, urged him toward insurance arrangements he found troubling, and the marriage dissolved, with Robinson surviving the acquaintance, one of the few adult men in this record who did. It was after the breakdown of that arrangement that Mary Ann formed a relationship with Frederick Cotton, a widower and colliery worker in West Auckland, whose first wife had died, and whose sister-in-law, who had been keeping house for him, would also die not long after Mary Ann's arrival in the household. Mary Ann married Frederick Cotton in 1870, becoming stepmother to his surviving children, Charles Edward Cotton among them. Frederick Cotton is described in the limited surviving record as a steady colliery worker, a man with no history of scandal or financial trouble prior to his second marriage, keeping a modest household on a miner's wage. He died in December 1871, roughly a year into the marriage, his death attributed at the time to gastric fever, the same diagnosis that had now been applied across more than a decade and multiple households to an alarming number of people connected to his wife. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, back to the record. With Frederick Cotton dead, Mary Ann Cotton remained in the West Auckland household with her stepson Charles and her own infant son by Frederick, a boy named Robert. Her financial situation, never secure, appears to have grown more precarious in the months that followed her husband's death. It was around this period that a man named Joseph Natras re-entered her life, a former acquaintance from an earlier chapter of her history, now lodging in the same household. Surviving accounts suggest an intimate relationship between Cotton and Natras during this period, one that placed her stepchildren in the position of dependents she may have regarded as obstacles to a fresh domestic arrangement unencumbered by another man's children. Compounding this was a specific and practical friction: local relief authorities. Thomas Riley, a parish official responsible for administering poor relief and workhouse placements in West Auckland, later testified that Mary Ann had approached him in the spring of 1872, asking whether her stepson Charles could be placed in the workhouse, since she wished to take up paid work as a nurse, and could not, she said, manage the boy alongside her own commitments. Riley refused the request on the grounds that if Charles entered the workhouse, Mary Ann herself, as his legal guardian and stepmother with means, would be required to enter alongside him under the poor law provisions then in force, an outcome she plainly did not want. According to Riley's later account, Mary Ann responded to this refusal with a remark to the effect that it would not matter greatly, because the boy, like others before him in the household, was sickly and might not live long regardless. It is this remark, more than any single piece of physical evidence, that would return to haunt the investigation that followed. It is worth pausing here to place this domestic tragedy within its wider historical moment. Mid-Victorian Britain was a society only beginning to develop the institutional and scientific apparatus necessary to detect poisoning as a systematic crime rather than a private misfortune. Arsenic in this period was cheap, widely available for legitimate purposes, as a rat poison, a dye component, an ingredient in some cosmetics and in domestic wallpaper pigments, and almost entirely unregulated at the point of sale in many parts of the country, notwithstanding earlier legislative attempts to restrict its purchase. Death certification in rural and industrial communities alike was frequently handled by local doctors working from clinical observation alone without post-mortem examination, particularly in cases involving children, whose deaths from gastric illness were common enough to require no special scrutiny. It was into this gap, between a poison that was everywhere and a system of death certification that assumed the worst explanation was rarely the true one, that a pattern of deaths across 4 decades and multiple households had, until this point, gone almost entirely unexamined by the authorities. The final illness of Charles Edward Cotton began, according to surviving testimony, in early July 1872. He was described by neighbours as having been in reasonable health in the days prior, and his decline, once it began, followed a course consistent with severe gastric distress, vomiting, abdominal pain, and a rapid deterioration over a period the record places at somewhere between 1 and several days. Mary Ann Cotton was, by her own account and by the account of neighbours who observed the household, attending to the boy directly during this illness, preparing food and drink for him, in a domestic role entirely unremarkable for a stepmother nursing a sick child. What cannot be established with certainty from the surviving trial record is the precise number of occasions or the precise method by which arsenic, if administered, was introduced into his food. The prosecution's case, as will be discussed, rested on toxicological findings after death, rather than on any eyewitness account of poison being administered. Charles Edward Cotton died on the 12th of July 1872. There was, in the strict sense, no concealment or disposal in this case of the kind associated with other categories of homicide. No attempt to hide a body, move it, or dispose of physical evidence. The concealment, such as it was, operated instead through the ordinary and unremarkable mechanisms of Victorian death. A local doctor's certificate attributing the death to natural gastric illness, a burial arranged in the customary manner, and the collection, in the normal course, of a small payment from a burial club policy that had been taken out on the boy's life. Had matters proceeded along the same path as they had in every previous instance across more than a decade, the record would very likely have closed there, with a death certificate, a burial, and no further inquiry. The discovery that broke this pattern arose not from any deliberate investigative act, but from the accumulated unease of 2 men whose involvement with the case was, in each instance, incidental to their actual duties. Thomas Riley, the parish relief officer who had refused Mary Ann's request to place Charles in the workhouse only weeks earlier, learned of the boy's sudden death and recalled her remark that the child was sickly and might not live long. Riley took this recollection, together with his general unease about the household, to the local police and separately to a doctor, urging that the death be examined rather than certified in the ordinary way. Around the same time, the doctor who had been attending the household, a man named Kilburn, who had initially been prepared to issue a certificate citing natural causes, was persuaded, by Riley's intervention, and by his own growing hesitation, given the household's history, to withhold a final certificate pending further examination. This hesitation, procedurally minor in itself, opened the investigation that followed. In the days after Charles's death, a preliminary examination of stomach contents was undertaken, and traces consistent with arsenic were identified using chemical tests then coming into standard use in cases of suspected poisoning. A set of techniques associated with the chemist James Marsh, whose method for detecting minute quantities of arsenic in bodily tissue had, by this period, become the standard forensic tool in cases of this kind. Once the presence of arsenic was confirmed in Charles Edward Cotton's remains, the investigation widened rapidly. Local police, aware now of the household's history, the earlier deaths of Frederick Cotton, of another child in the household, and of Joseph Nattrass, the lodger with whom Mary Ann was believed to have been intimately involved, all of whom had died within the preceding year, sought and obtained authority to exhume additional bodies for examination. The exhumations that followed, conducted over the succeeding weeks, extended the toxicological inquiry beyond Charles alone. Arsenic was identified in the remains of Frederick Cotton and of Joseph Nattrass, both of whom had been buried within the previous 12 months under diagnoses of natural gastric illness. The pattern that emerged, one household, several deaths within a short span, a consistent poison, and a woman at the center of each, moved the case from a single suspicious death to what the press of the period would soon characterize as a wide-ranging poisoning inquiry. Though it should be noted that not every death later attributed to Mary Ann Cotton in popular retellings was subject to exhumation or forensic confirmation. Several of the deaths counted in later tallies rest on circumstantial pattern rather than direct toxicological proof, a distinction the surviving record requires be made explicit. Mary Ann Cotton was arrested on the 18th of July 1872, within days of her stepson's death, and the doctor's refusal to certify it without further examination. Her arrest did not arise from any dramatic manhunt or chance recognition by a stranger. It arose directly from the suspicions of the two men already named, communicated through ordinary local channels to the police, who acted on information rather than pursuit. At the time of her arrest, Mary Ann was several months pregnant, a circumstance that would delay her trial by a matter of months, since procedure of the period did not permit the execution of a pregnant woman and required that any capital trial and its consequence wait upon the birth of the child. The forensic and medical testimony assembled ahead of trial was, by the standards of the period, unusually detailed. Toxicologists and medical witnesses described, in testimony later summarized in press accounts of the proceedings, the process by which arsenic had been identified in the exhumed remains, the Marsh test's chemical reduction of suspect tissue to reveal a metallic deposit whose presence confirmed arsenic beyond the threshold explainable by environmental or accidental exposure. Witnesses for the prosecution also addressed and sought to rule out the defense's central alternative explanation, that arsenic present in the household, whether in wallpaper pigment, a substance known to have been used in some domestic dyes of the period, or in other legitimate household uses such as rat poison, might have been inhaled or otherwise accidentally ingested by Charles without any deliberate act on his stepmother's part. The prosecution's toxicological witnesses testified that the concentration and distribution of arsenic found in the boy's remains were inconsistent with incidental environmental exposure and consistent instead with direct ingestion in food or drink over a short period preceding death. An inquest, convened in the ordinary course following the exhumations, returned a finding that Charles Edward Cotton had died as a result of arsenic poisoning, and the matter was referred forward for criminal trial, though it bears note for accuracy's sake that the formal criminal charge against Mary Ann Cotton, the charge actually brought before a jury, concerned the death of Charles Edward Cotton alone. The wider pattern of deaths across her earlier marriages and households was raised at trial as evidence of pattern and intent, admissible to rebut any suggestion of accident or coincidence, but she was tried, in the strict legal sense, for a single killing. The trial opened at Durham Assizes in March 1873, following the birth of Mary Ann's child in custody. The prosecution's case rested on three connected pillars: the toxicological evidence establishing arsenic as the cause of Charles Edward Cotton's death, the circumstantial evidence of opportunity and motive, including Riley's account of her remark about the boy's likely fate, and evidence regarding her financial circumstances and the burial club policy on the child's life, and the broader pattern of deaths surrounding her across more than a decade, offered not as separate charges, but as evidence tending to rebut the possibility of coincidence or accident. The defense, for its part, argued along the line first raised at the inquest, that the arsenic detected in Charles's remains could have originated from an environmental source within the household, principally arsenic-based pigment in wallpaper, a genuine hazard of the period, and one the defense sought to establish through expert testimony of its own regarding contemporary domestic arsenic use. The jury's deliberation, according to press accounts of the period, was brief, reported at under 2 hours, and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. Sentencing followed directly, in keeping with the procedure of the period for a capital conviction. The presiding judge pronounced the sentence of death, remarking, according to newspaper summaries of the proceeding, on the deliberate and calculated character of the crime as established by the evidence, and on the particular gravity of a crime committed by a stepmother against a child placed under her direct care and protection. No appeal process of the kind familiar to later eras existed in a form that altered the outcome, and the sentence stood. Mary Ann Cotton was executed on the 24th of March 1873 at Durham County Gaol. Surviving press accounts of the execution describe a hanging that did not proceed cleanly. The drop, misjudged by the officiating executioner, failed to produce an immediate death, and witnesses reported that she struggled for a period of several minutes before dying, a detail that entered the historical record as one of the more widely repeated particulars of the case, though it should be treated, as with much execution reporting of the period, as drawn from press witnesses rather than an official technical record. In the days before her execution, under repeated questioning from a Wesleyan minister attending her in custody, Mary Ann Cotton made a partial and hesitant acknowledgement regarding Charles's death, without offering a full confession, and when pressed regarding the other deaths associated with her household across the preceding decades, she is recorded as having made no direct reply, turning away rather than answering. She was buried within the grounds of the gaol in keeping with standard practice for executed prisoners of the period. The legacy of the case did not end with her burial. In the years that followed, Mary Ann Cotton's name entered popular memory through an unusual channel, a children's rhyme, sung in playgrounds across the north of England for generations afterward, reducing the entire case to a handful of macabre lines that far outlasted any formal historical account of the trial itself. For much of the 20th century, her case receded from serious historical or criminological attention, overshadowed in the popular imagination by later and more heavily mythologized cases of Victorian murder. It was not until the early 21st century, through renewed academic and journalistic interest, including work by criminologists examining the case as a serial killing predating the term itself by more than a century, that Mary Ann Cotton was more widely reassessed and popularly described as, in the words several historians have since used, Britain's first documented serial killer, her death toll estimated across various accounts at somewhere between 15 and 21 victims, a range that reflects the genuine limits of what forensic examination in the 1870s was able to establish beyond the single charge on which she was actually convicted. The case of Mary Ann Cotton was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1873. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.